Hi, everyone, and welcome to this first UK and Changing Europe lunch hour of the new term. Welcome back. I hope you're in a nice summer. We're joined by our A team for this discussion of the state of UK-EU relations, what might happen during the negotiations to come, where the fabled reset is and might end up. I'm sure none of these people need introducing, but let me do it very quickly. Jannike Wachowiak, one of our researchers here, Joel Rollon, another of our researchers here, Catherine Barnard from University of Cambridge and UK and Changing Europe, and finally, the one and only Jill Rotter. Just as a start of a TED, and remember, everyone, put your questions in Slido if you have them, and vote for the questions you can see in Slido when they start appearing, just so I know which ones you want me to pose to the panel. But just to kick us off, and I'll pick someone to go first in a minute. Where do you reckon we've reached in terms of the UK-EU relationship? Has much progress been made under this Starmer government? Is there much more to come, do you think? And I'm going to start with Jill.
Thought you might do that, Anand. Lovely to see you again. Not at the cricket. Where are we? I think it's quite interesting because clearly there are huge numbers of meetings about very live issues going on. I mean, lots and lots of things. But because of the security situation, which seems to be deteriorating almost by the day with the news out of Poland last night, a lot of that is under the umbrella of NATO, where we're already cooperating anyway. But I think, in a sense, we've reached a sort of position where the relationship has normalized and maybe settled at a sort of new level, where we've got over the sort of impact of the change of government and this Keir Starmer, he's a sort of easier bloke to do business with than those Conservatives we were dealing with before. So I think we've reached sort of bit of a new normal, which could translate into, well, is there loads and loads of forward momentum going on? So I think it's quite interesting. So I think the UK is just a player certainly on the security side, though I'm sure Jannike will want to come in on actually, are we seeing that converted into anything on the safe partnership and the security and defence deal? I thought the thing that was really interesting, two more things. I thought that it's possible to detect, and maybe this from Nick Thomas-Symonds, lead on the reset, and Stephen Doughty, the Foreign Affairs Minister who deals with Europe, who seems to have stayed in his job, which is obviously quite unusual after last week's shenanigans. We're giving evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee, very sort of friendly audience in Emily Thornberry as the chair, seem to be more willing to talk positively about Europe, so a bit less timid perhaps than we saw in the earlier phases. And I thought that was also quite striking, some of the things that Nick Thomas-Symonds said when he made his speech to the Spectator, that he was prepared to go to the Spectator, sit in the Unheard Cafe or wherever they were doing it, and speak more positively about the benefits, notably a much more positive tone, say, on youth mobility. Yes, it will be capped, but actually to hear the government saying, actually, there could be some quite good things in this rather than something that we're being dragged into against our will because annoying Europeans are absolutely insisting on it. So I think that, but I thought the interesting thing there, though, was the timetable he set out on the SBS agreement, that you might, I mean, probably a very realistic timetable, but don't expect to be able to ditch your export health certificate before 2027, which was the first time we'd heard a date on that. And that probably shows the realization of the amount of work that it's going to take to get that deal agreed. Because one of the things I thought the government did rather oddly in May was to present things as a done deal, when, if you read the common understanding, it was very much not a done deal. It was a sort of heads of agreement of areas that we would talk, and quite a lot of UK interest, where the EU politely battered them into some very long grass, I thought.
Okay. I mean, I have to say, the one thing that struck me about Nick Thomas-Symonds was he's obviously decided that this is not just a terrain where they don't need to be as worried as they had been politically, but it was a terrain on which he was willing to explicitly fight reform, because the whole thing was couched in terms of we're fixing the mess the Tories made. Nigel Farage can moan all he likes. We're doing stuff for British consumers, which I thought was interesting. We'll see how much that is carried forward. But Catherine, do you think 2027 is feasible to get this SPS deal?
It's going to be tough, actually. Can I start with something dull and legally? A lawyer, indeed. I thought that would cheer you up. First and foremost,
cut the feed.
What happened since May is that there is now mandates. Now, mandates is the EU technical term for giving the Commission the power to negotiate. And there are two mandates, one on SPS and greenhouse emissions trading systems, and the other one on what's now called the Youth Experience Scheme. The one, the Youth Experience Scheme, is in fact very thin indeed. One small footnote to note about that is that Denmark will not be taking part in the adoption of the decision. And it's also worth noting on the youth mobility or youth experience programme that member states will be free to determine the volumes of admissions of third country nationals. And national security remains the responsibility of the member states. So that's but very little detail, although of course we saw what the Commission was proposing in May 2024. In respect of the SPS mandate, I think what's interesting here is that you've got in the same mandate SPS sanitary and phytosanitary, and also greenhouse emissions trading systems. Risk is that they'll get tied together and they need to be negotiated as a whole. And there are still major issues to sort out. Cost, how much we're going to contribute, exactly how will the dispute resolution mechanism work, and what about the carve-outs for the UK? There is a recognition that there will be very limited derogations for the UK, presumably about gene editing, but how exactly will that work and how exactly will that be controlled? And then there's a very practical issue for the UK to sort out, which is, of course, we have turned off the conduit pipe. And by that I mean, when we remember the EU under the European Communities Act, there was provision in Section 2.2 of the European Communities Act for EU measures to become part of UK law via statutory instrument. There isn't such a conduit pipe at the moment. That can be rectified, but it will not be uncontroversial. And then, of course, there's actually a large amount of legislation that the UK will have to implement because we will sign up to dynamic alignment.
Okay, we'll come back to the legislation and to parliamentary scrutiny because we've already got a question about that and I think it's really interesting. But actually, before I leave you, Catherine, is 2027 feasible for SPS, do you think, given the issues?
I think the confidence with which Nick Thomas-Symonds has said 2027, partly it's expectation management, but partly too, I mean, if this government really does want to take the fight to reform, they need to show that there's growth and there's benefit from their strategy. So that if there's going to be an election in 2028, they clearly need to get something sorted by 2027.
Okay. And actually, I want to turn to Jannike and Joel because I think both your pieces, well, certainly one of your, the SAFE explainer is on the website now. So let's start with that, Jannike. I mean, SAFE is the EU security scheme that the UK wants a part of. So can you just explain what it is and what the potential stumbling blocks are? Because we're getting a picture here, aren't we, that there are good intentions, certainly on the UK side, and a little bit more ambition, but the devil, to use a very favourite phrase of mine, might lie in the detail.
Yes, you're right. SAFE is the EU's defence fund, offering up to 150 billion euros in loans to EU member states. And in the common understanding, the EU and the UK committed to exploring UK participation in the SAFE programme. And the precondition for that is the security partnership that was published at the summit. So that's already in place. But you now need a negotiation on the terms and conditions for UK participation in common procurements. And what's quite interesting is that at the summit, there was actually the most confidence in terms of achieving swift results when it came to UK participation in SAFE. At the press conference, Ursula von der Leyen said she's hopeful that it will be only a matter of weeks until a deal with the UK will be done. Obviously, that is now in hindsight seems overly optimistic. And whilst, as Catherine has said, we've now seen mandates on SPS and on emissions trading schemes, there is still no mandate on UK participation in SAFE. Reportedly, this is due to internal disagreements among EU member states about the exact conditions under which the UK and other third countries outside the single market and other than Ukraine can participate in those common procurements. And the sticking points are around the level of the financial contribution. So if UK companies were to win contracts that are backed by EU loans, the EU side is saying the UK government would have to financially compensate Brussels for that. And some member states think that this contribution should be rather high, whilst others are keen on just getting a deal done with the UK. So there are kind of internal divisions. And of course, on the UK side, there's also caution about the level of the financial contribution. And we've already seen quite a bit of kind of media reporting in the UK about the UK paying too much money to the EU. Other sticking points are around intellectual property, control of exports, and the rules around that. So the EU is keen on not creating new dependencies on other third countries, including the UK in this case. So there are some question marks around that that will be difficult to resolve. And at the heart of this, there's a tension in between the kind of EU's objectives here, because on the one hand, the EU wants to kind of boost its defense spending and its ability to defend itself. And it wants to spend this money as efficiently as possible. And to do so, it needs member states to work together and Europeans to work together to avoid duplication and so on. But on the other hand, these kind of funds are designed in a way that EU domestic industries are the ones that benefit from this money. And the question is whether the UK counts as European under those schemes or not, and what percentage of kind of the components that are required for defense equipment can originate from the UK and countries outside of the single market and Ukraine. So there's kind of lots of unresolved questions and member states pulling into different directions. So this has been difficult to resolve. The problem is that there's a ticking clock here because EU member states need to apply for the loans by the 30th of November this year. So it's unclear at the moment whether if the UK is unable to negotiate an agreement by then, whether the UK might potentially miss out on the first round of procurements or whether there are some workarounds here, but lots of kind of unresolved questions despite the urgency in this area. So to kind of come back to your first question, since the summit on the 19th of May, not that much has happened, and that's partially due to the summer break, partially due to kind of internal EU processes, but also I think partially to kind of a lack of urgency.
Thank you. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it does strike me that there's a collaborative security dynamic and a competitive economic dynamic, and they kind of cut across each other a little bit, particularly when it comes to SAFE. Incidentally, for those listening, that wonderful background noise is Jannike's laptop computer. So if there's anyone watching from a massive tech firm who wants to sponsor our IT, then just stick it in the Slido straight away, please, and we'll be straight back to you on the phone. Joelle, there's a couple of things for you. There's a question come in which is worth talking about, I think, because it addresses that problem that you talked about in the last divergence tracker about this government and its steps to address the issue of passive divergence, so aligning a lot more than we've seen post-Brexit. But while you're at it, can you also just mention, because I know you've got a really nice piece of work about to come out on ETS alignment and the problems involved, that just to complete our set of potential pitfalls, can you just talk about that briefly as well?
Sure, yeah. I might start with ETS just because I think that's a kind of top agenda item for the autumn, and the divergent stuff is a little bit more general. So on ETS, it's an interesting story, really, because I think things are moving forward, and a lot of thinking is going on in terms of the EU's published its mandate, and the UK government is very active on the picture as well. What this would do for the uninitiated is it links the two sides emissions trading scheme. So that's a system which levies tariffs on carbon emissions in certain industrial sectors. It's designed to reduce industrial carbon emissions over time. But the problem is, if your systems aren't linked, then from the start of next year, UK exports will be subject to an EU carbon border tax, which is meant to replicate the EU domestic tariff on imports. And so if you can do this linking, which is quite a technical piece of work, you avoid a new, quite significant trading friction in the UK-EU relationship. There's a clear mutual interest in doing that, both for the economic benefits and also for Northern Ireland, because there's a very tricky question otherwise around where Northern Ireland applies the EU CBAM on Great Britain, things like that. But there are a couple of potential sticking points that I see. The first and most urgent is the fact that the EU CBAM takes effect from the 1st of January next year. And unless there is some heroic negotiating going on, the ETS linkage is not going to be completed by then. So that means we're going to hit that CBAM problem pretty quickly. The UK could ask for an exemption. I imagine they probably are. I know Nick Thomas has publicly said he's aware of this cliff edge at the start of next year, but the EU might not want to give it for two reasons. I think one is negotiating leverage. If the if the UK has an exemption, the urgency to get the wider linkage done kind of diminishes. And secondly, other countries will cry foul and they'll say, we want the same. There's lots of countries, not least the United States, that are very unhappy about the CBAM. And so that's going to be a tricky issue to resolve almost immediately. And then the other key issue is that question of dynamic alignment. Because on the SPS deal, I think there's an acceptance in the UK. You align with more or less the entirety of the relevant EU legislation because you are de facto opting into the single market in that area. But ETS is different, at least from a UK position. It's viewed as a linkage. It's not, you are not participating straightly inside the EU ETS. And so there's a UK memorandum, I think, out on this, basically saying that they think the Commission's position goes too far in insisting on full-scale dynamic alignment. So that's likely to be a really tricky negotiation around exactly which bits of EU regulation does the UK have to swallow. There's more beyond that, read the briefing when it comes out next week, but I think those are the two kind of top issues. And on then that question of alignment more generally, I think it's interesting, as Jill was saying, that this government is becoming bolder in making the case for closer alignment with the EU. I think that's a product of a changing geopolitical landscape where the United States is seen as more of a foe and among public opinion seen as more of an ally. People, generally speaking, want to get closer, and the Brexit wars don't have the salience they once did. Even Nigel Farage has barely uttered a word about emissions trading, even though it's a carbon tax levied by Brussels. You'd think that'd be a dream for him, but he's kind of let it lie. So there's a political space there to do something. Is the UK going to do more? I mean, we can get into the detail, but I think the kind of broad point I would make on this at this point in time is obviously the focus for the next year is going to be these negotiations and coming to the next UK-EU summit by next May, having made significant progress. But from a UK perspective, there may be a chance to go further, given what the government is now saying about its ambitions for closer EU relations. And if you want to do that by 2029 and you want to deliver the material benefits that you see coming within that by 2029, that work needs to be starting now. So I think there's an interesting question about whether there are any other background discussions going on for future agreements to initiate sooner rather than later. That might be chemicals, medicines, manufacturing sectors, things like that. So that's another thing to watch, I think.
Okay, thank you. Just to take you up on your point about the sort of politics of this, I don't know if any of you read or watched Peter Mandelson's Ditchley speech, but it was a very, very striking speech in that it basically portrayed the world as, you know, this is the conflict between the US and China that's looming, and we have to take sides, and the side we have to take is the side of the United States. And my sense reading that speech was that if he was speaking for the British government, and of course we don't know whether he was or not, that actually siding with the US or aligning with the US, particularly on things like tech, is a massive priority for geopolitical reasons. And so I just wonder whether that debate is as neat as you intimated, Joelle, that actually, I mean, this, you know, I sense a different mood actually from May. In May, it was very much the case, I think, that EU and UK negotiators, almost in a state of shock from what Donald Trump was doing, seemed quite aligned and seemed determined to do stuff together because it made a lot of sense to do stuff together, given what the Americans were doing. I'm just wondering whether or not that is still the case to such an extent now. I don't know if any of you got any thoughts on that. Sorry, that was a bit of a speech rather than a question. Jill, did you just click a button?
Yes, that was a bit of a speech.
Sorry.
Clearly, you ought to be the panel, and I'm very happy to take over the chair if you want to be a panelist. Because I have to say, I was watching the US Open tennis rather than Peter Mandelson's Ditchley speech, which is my bat, and I will go and watch that. I mean, Mandelson has to be speaking for the British government. He's our ambassador to Washington, and however much leeway you get out of having a former politician, he should be clearing what he says with the government. We've seen the government crack down on civil servants appearing in public in rather counterproductive, sort of Trump-like way, but he should be representing the British government's views. But I thought it was quite interesting, if you're reading Ursula von der Leyen's State of the European Union speech today, that I think it was today that I've been looking at it, that she seems to be actually sort of trying to big up Europe as a separate, independent player, sort of master of its fate, and almost offering itself. It doesn't mention the UK at all, as far as I can see on my very quick read. But Europe. This is Europe's independence. We have to be independent. Do this. We have to do this independently. So not in a sense accepting that Mandelsonian narrative that the world is dominated by two big blocks, and you have to be opting for one or the other, which I thought was quite an interesting way of putting things. Of course, it would help if European governments weren't looking fragile all over the place, and Europe could get its sort of economic act together, which it clearly isn't that much. But I mean, one of the things we do know about Peter Mandelson is that he has been pushing very heavily this sort of tech partnership idea with the US. That was a sort of unfinished business from that bizarre scene in the Oval Office when they launched the UK's sort of quick out of the blocks mini trade deal, tariff mitigator, or whatever you want to call it, back earlier in the summer. Was that, this was part one, and the next thing was this big tech partnership, and Mandelson certainly has been bigging up this idea of the UK as a sort of almost European foothold, a sort of tech island where US companies would find sort of quite favourable environment for them to operate. And I think it's really interesting whether that becomes, we've managed to get the UK securing a sort of trade access, the EU doing it, a slightly different deal, better for some sectors than the UK slightly better for other sectors. If you look at baseline versus inclusive and all these, confusing things about tariffs, which are an absolute nightmare. But I think it's really interesting whether that becomes a sort of biggish sticking point in UK-EU relations, which so far haven't, Starmer has managed to keep walking the tightrope and hasn't fallen off in one direction or the other, which I think some of us have been expecting might have happened a bit sooner. So, is this the thing where, finally the rope swings and he falls one side or the other?
I mean, there does seem to be an opening gap between us and the European Union on digital services tax, for instance, given the language. Jannike, did you just put your hand up? How very polite of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to come in with kind of my reading of Nick Thomas's Simmons speech at the Spectator, and also kind of their appearance at the Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday. And my sense would be that this is very much about controlling the domestic narrative around what is about to happen, which is the UK dynamically aligning with the EU in various sectors. And it's about kind of selling this as in the UK's national interest and making this point. But it's about defending what you've basically already have agreed to do, rather than pitching to go further and to be more ambitious in the relationship with the European Union. I think the focus is also very much on the domestic dimension, in terms of that the way he talks about it is not so much in geopolitical terms, but more in terms of direct benefits for UK citizens. So the pitch is now around borders, bills, and jobs. They've actually dropped the kind of geopolitical dimension and European security. The previous pitch was around prosperity, safety, and security, which was obviously a bit vague and ominous. So that's maybe why they've moved on to borders, bills, and jobs. But the focus here very much on kind of what this means for UK domestic politics. I was also quite struck by Keir Starmer's appearance in front of the liaison committee in July this year, where he was asked about, well, you know, the summit with the European Union was a success, but what's next? What are your ambitions beyond that? And he gave quite a short and vague answer in which the only areas he mentioned were medicines, but also without really saying what he meant, and touring artists, which obviously is a long-standing UK demand, which the Conservative government has already tried to kind of make some changes here. Then Labour has tried largely unsuccessfully. But beyond that, he didn't really have anything to say. So I don't really see kind of some of the changing language that Labour is using at the moment. I see kind of as preparation for what's to come, and maybe some of the pushback that they might get from UK media in particular when it comes to dynamic alignment, but also financial contributions that they will have to make. And also questions around control, how much influence will they have on the EU rules that they will have to adopt and so on, rather than actually them trying to be more ambitious than they've been so far.
Okay, you're slightly wrecking my carefully planned order now, but we'll come on to what the future might hold, where the politics is in a minute. Actually, one thing I just want to talk about for a moment longer, and maybe this is for you, Catherine, is you said that the mandate on youth mobility was a little bit thin. Do we expect this to go relatively smoothly? Do we think there is a deal that the UK and EU can agree on here, or do you foresee this being problematic, particularly given the fact that immigration just continues to rise in political salience in this country?
I think we can distinguish between immigration and youth experience or youth mobility, because what's clear is that the youth mobility scheme will be time limited, 1 year or two probably. They're young people, so less likely to be a burden on public services. And I mean, obviously, we know about the EU's interest in it. What's more encouraging, I think, is that Nick Thomas-Symmers is talking in a much more upbeat way about the benefits for British young people and getting their experiences abroad. And this takes you not just in respect of the UK-EU relationship, but remember too that there's been such a significant decline in language learning at school. And one of the reasons are that the opportunities for living, working abroad have been reduced post-Brexit. And so I think this is something that where things could make a difference. I think there's going to be two large sticking blocks. One will be any health service surcharge that's going to be levied. The EU, remember, said we don't want it. And two, what's it mean about access to universities and what fees will be paid? And these are both very difficult issues, not just in terms of the negotiation, but also in terms of the broader migration picture. And if I may just say one other issue on the migration front, which is not directly on the youth experience scheme, but don't forget, in the background are some serious challenges to the European Convention on Human Rights. And Nigel Farage has also said we should be leaving the Refugee Convention. Now, I can talk at length about the ECHR, but I think for now the point is that leaving the ECHR will not in any way deal with the problem of small boats. The ECHR says nothing about admission of people to the country and nothing about rights of residence. It's where it does have some impact is about deportation. But were we to leave the ECHR, this would have very serious implications for the future of our membership of the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And it would also put a kibosh, I think, on any of the negotiations that we've been talking about.
Okay, though presumably if we have a Nigel Farage government, we wouldn't be having these negotiations anyway, so that's life a lot easier. But I mean, you sound, I mean, what the rest of you think. Are you as upbeat as Catherine sounded about youth mobility? And I suppose the second part of the question, which has fascinated me ever since the summit, is the degree, if any, to which these things are linked. So let's say, negotiations over youth mobility stall. Does that mean that the EU say, well, actually, we might drag our feet a bit on SPS then in that case? I mean, do you get the sense that these things are interrelated? Go on, John.
Yeah. Yes, I do. I mean, I think one way to read that is literally in the text. So the mandate on SPS and ETS, there's a lot of sort of communal language, I suppose, between the two agreements. So saying they must both be governed by this type of supervisory mechanism, dispute resolution, so forth. So there are clearly intellectual linkages, and they are going to have to be uniform. So to some extent, that means those negotiations need to be happening in parallel. There needs to be conversations between those two sets of issues. So in a very literal sense, they are linked. But yes, I also think politically, they will be as well, because youth mobility is likely to be the most difficult one from a kind of EU perspective of where is the UK most likely to drag its feet, to raise challenges which we don't like. And so that's probably a card which you need to hold back if, you need to hold the UK's feet to the fire over that issue. You can't just have given away SPS and ETS automatically. So I think from a political perspective, they are very likely to be joined in some sense. And I do have questions as well about how much thinking has been done on the UK side about the negotiating strategy. Obviously, the original Brexit negotiations, I think it's fair to say the Commission sort of wiped the floor repeatedly with the UK side. I don't think we're in that realm yet again, but we have this 27 date for SPS. There's nothing more specific than that. We don't know if it's the start or the 31st of December. We have nothing on ETS, even though that, given the CBAM deadline, is something quite urgent. And I just see there is a risk of these things really dragging, political momentum being taken out of them if other priorities come up. I mean, von Leyen's speech tells you that there is a lot on the EU's agenda. And to keep these things moving forward at pace, you need clear targets, you need clear milestones. And one summit a year between the UK and the EU isn't necessarily enough to get that moving quickly. So it's not just about the linkages which are going to be made between those negotiations, but also keeping the momentum and the political interest in them, I think, is a significant related challenge.
I suppose, I'll come to you in a sec, Jannike. I know you want to come in on this. I suppose in that regard, the fact that we have some deadlines to focus our minds is possibly a good thing. So we have the introduction of the CBAM by the EU, which is an obvious deadline. We've also, I think, got more electric vehicle rules of origin deadlines looming on the horizon, haven't we, in the next sort of couple of years, which that old chestnut's coming back. So, but I take your point. I mean, one of the big structural differences with the original negotiations is the ticking clock isn't quite as big and brash and all-consuming as it was back then, which means that it's, if other priorities intervene, it'd be quite easy for this thing to lose a lot of momentum. Sorry, Jannike, turn your drill back on.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, just to add to what Catherine and Joelle have said on youth mobility, I think this is going to be extremely difficult. If you look at kind of the wording and the common understanding, youth mobility is kind of the one area where it's quite clear from reading a common understanding that there is very little common understanding, actually. So all we know is that, it's going to be time limited. It's going to be on the basis of a visa, and there's going to be some form of limit on numbers. Those were kind of the 3 points the two sides could agree on. When it comes to the limit on numbers, I think that's going to be quite controversial, because the original EU mandate, of course, didn't suggest any quotas at all, so unlimited numbers. And if you listened to Nick Thomas-Symonds in this kind of evidence session with the Foreign Affairs Committee, he was very clear that it has to be a capped scheme. So this seems to be a red line for the UK, and he very much sees the scheme within the context of the UK's existing youth mobility schemes. So the UK has 13 schemes with various other countries. And if you look at the kind of terms and conditions for those schemes, they are all for 2 years. Some of them can be extended for another year. And if you look at the annual quotas, the kind of smallest one is for Andorra, which has 100 places per year. And the kind of largest contingent is for Australia, which has 45,000 places per year. I doubt that the European Union would be content with 45,000, also given kind of the difference in population numbers between Australia and the EU, and that it's 27 or 26 EU member states who want to participate in this. So I think kind of the conversation around numbers is going to be really difficult. And in addition to the annual health surcharge and tuition fees, which Catherine already mentioned, I think there's probably also going to be some haggling around the cost of the UK visa, family reunion, and potentially kind of the ability for young British people to move within the EU as well. Because as part of the original EU mandate, there was no provision for intra-EU mobility. So I think there's lots of sticking points here, and it's going to be quite a tricky one.
Okay, Jill, did you?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think the really interesting thing on this is whether the EU's in any mood to sort of compromise and actually say that there are young people who are being denied this now. It would be better to have a limited scheme that the UK can accept. And I thought it was quite interesting, the news last week that the DfE was getting a contract for running Erasmus and rejoining that potentially for someone to administer that. Is the EU prepared to say, actually, you're better to have a limited scheme, and once maybe there's proof of concept that it's actually publicly acceptable things, the UK may go further, you'd have a sort of review mechanism in it? Or does it really want to go for broke now at the risk that it will just be too much for a British government to swallow? So I think there's a really interesting question on the EU side there of how sort of purist and absolutist does it need to be, or would it say that, I think actually, the Australian scheme, I don't think gets anywhere near 45,000 Australians actually coming here. I think far more Brits go to Australia than come here, and I think it's more like 20,000 or something. But I may be wrong on that. Just don't fact check me. But I think it's really interesting, whether there is a mood for compromise and that's something to allow some people to do it who may actually be aging out of that cohort if you don't get something done relatively quickly. Is it better to hang on till 2035 to get the scheme, once maybe we've been through a reform government and then swung back the other way? Yeah. So where are you on this? Do you bank something, even if it's not as good as you might ultimately want? Is there that sort of mood? And then how does it link politically? And I think the really interesting thing about having a summit next year is that for summits, you always they will want, and the political imperative would be to have some positive announceables at that summit that they can point to and say, we have made progress. And that will be on both sides. I think we want to do that, but it'll be more imperative for the UK side, I think, to point to some concrete benefits coming out of its reset than it will be for the EU, where it'll be just another of these bilateral summits.
Yeah. Australia's further away as well, I hear, which might make a difference. But anyway, I want to look a little bit towards the future. Actually, Paul Adamson's put a question in the chat about something I've completely and utterly forgotten about, which is the TCA review. In this context, what is the TCA? We wrote that thing whenever it was like decades ago, about how the TCA review was going to be basically a sort of administrative exercise in making sure everything was working fine. Have we revised our opinions on that? Do we think in the current context, you've got geopolitical uncertainty, you've got a bit of a sense of, things moving. Does that change, Joel?
Okay, so as a co-author of that report, it's 2 years ago, along with Jannike. I would say, yeah, I mean, it is sort of political lifetime ago. To me, at the time, the way the review was used felt more than anything like a political signalling device for the Labour Party, because it was a way to be able to talk about a closer EU relationship without scaring Brexit supporters, because the whole point was this is something which is already inserted into Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. There is a clause that says after 5 years we can look again and change some things. So it was a way to say, we're working with what we have. We're not going to undo it. We're not going to betray Brexit, but this is there. And so we will use that opportunity, which Johnson negotiated, to do some things like, I think they were talking about, touring artists, professional qualifications, that kind of stuff. It was a way into the conversation. And then since then, I think the landscape has moved. And we now have kind of the structure around the summits, which I think is a much more obvious way to do these negotiations. For a start, it's a Starmer von der Leyen summit, which is what you really need. You need that leader level dialogue if you're going to push things forward significantly. The TCA review would be governed by Šefčovič and Thomas Simmons as the chairs of the Joint Committee. And so it's a more technical process thing, which is about reviewing the implementation and so forth. And given what else is there, I don't really see what you would use the TCA review for, other than kind of tricky little technical things which need ironing out. But Jannike might disagree.
Does anyone disagree? Jannike?
No, I agree. I agree with Joel. I don't think it's going to be a big deal, because you have kind of the process now that's been started with the summit. I think the TCA review is going to be what it is according to the treaty, which is a review of the implementation, which is going to be quite technical. Of course, it could be an opportunity for the UK government to bring up any grievances, and the same goes for the European Union, which could be around level playing field, which could be around issues that have been brought up in the past. And, they kind of monitor what's going on in each other's policy spheres. So if there are any issues there, that can be brought up as part of the review. But I don't think it's going to be an opportunity to kind of start a new negotiation in an entirely new area and to build on the TCA, because that process is now well underway.
Okay, actually, Joel, and please keep voting for questions you want me to ask, because loads of them have disappeared off the bottom of my screen now. So if there are ones you want me to ask, if you vote for them, they'll pop back up and I'll notice them. But one thing we haven't mentioned so far, I suppose, is the electricity markets, because of course that was talked about at the summit as an area where you might see the UK in the EU's electricity market. Is that where are we on that, first and foremost, and what are the prospects?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think this comes back to the point I was making about political momentum. And I think electricity markets is the one where there is the biggest risk of drift, because there is so much which remains to be defined. The whole reason why they've made this commitment in the first place is because the previous way which they wanted to solve inefficiencies in electricity trading wasn't working, because you basically had to invent a new form of energy trading system from scratch, which had never been used before. And so it seemed like a kind of a simpler solution is to reintegrate into the EU system. But even then, there's a lot which you have to kind of get your head around. And, even as someone who professes to be an expert in this kind of area, it makes my brain melt when I start to look at the questions around how electricity linkage works. So this is like one for the uber nerds, basically. And I think the combination of lack of precedent, I mean, even though Switzerland does have this linkage, but kind of coming out and then going back in, and then just the technicality of it makes it quite difficult. And I think we're still very much in the realm of preliminary conversation. And when you think about how even something like ETS, which has a much more clearly defined path, a clear amount of pre-existing alignment and precedent in terms of previous negotiations, could take a couple of years to complete. I think electricity, could be quite a big challenge to do it even by the point of the next election. I mean, I don't know, but yeah, it seems like there's a lot more undefinable there than the other issues.
I'm just waiting for that killer question from Matt Hine to appear in the Slido now, or at least an answer from Matt actually would be quite good on some of that. But Catherine, are you unmuted for a reason? Did you want to come in?
I was just going to say, actually, not about the electricity market, just on the TCA review, just two things.
Oh, sorry.
One was just to say that obviously if the common understanding ever got implemented in full, it would be far more radical than any TCA review. And the other thing I think is worth noting is that the committee structure set up under the TCA is working better now than it did under Boris Johnson, and therefore some of the niggles and issues are at least being discussed there, if not sorted out.
Okay, that's interesting. There's a really interesting question from Mark English, actually, which just really got me thinking about the fact that actually do we now find ourselves in a situation where this government needs progress and actually needs progress far more than the EU needs progress. And actually, one of the things about Nick Thomas-Symonds saying the things he said is they've sort of pinned their flag to that mast, haven't they? We're going to sort this out. We're going to get it done. It's going to help British voters. And it's led to a sort of asymmetry in how much each side needs and wants this thing to work, doesn't it? Does that put us in a slightly vulnerable position as the UK in these talks?
But Anand, that's always been true.
No, okay.
I mean, throughout everything, throughout Brexit, simply because the relative sizes, the EU takes half of our trade, we are, a significant but not that significant market for the EU. So the default has always been that way. And it's, it was cemented in as well then by the Boris Johnson deal, which was, a pretty good deal for the EU. And that's why we've always had this problem of having relatively few demands of us. That said, I think that, there will be some companies who are desperately hoping to avoid CBAMs. There will be, the agri-food sector undoubtedly would love to be free of some of the burdensome checks going, and that probably goes as well for farmers in the north if we ever get around to implementing border controls properly and things like that. But I think the government may want to do this. Will this be a critical factor in what if the government's, unless the government's clearly winning, will be a 2029 election? I'm not sure there's anything much here that's going to be massively on the billboards. I'm probably the most high profile thing at the moment will be what I experienced when I went into Prague on the first day they were testing out their new EES terminals in August. Was lots of people standing in queues and some blokes saying, I thought we were going to be able to get in much more easily now, because Prague is one of the places that Nick Thomas-Symonds lauds the advent of e-gates. And whatever I encountered at Prague certainly wasn't quick and swift. It was really quite prolonged. But I just don't think the things there are that relevant to huge numbers of people. And as we keep on saying, the government's demands, even if they implement them, are not the thing that are making a difference between a UK growth rate of, plus or minus 1% decimal point, as opposed to 2.5%, 3%. So, I don't think it's that critical, even for the UK. Maybe different on the defence side, but, and certainly applies differently to different sectors. But I don't think it inordinately matters to most people. I think it may be different in Northern Ireland. But people vote on different things there anyway, and that doesn't really affect the shape of the next general election.
I mean, on defence, Jannike, obviously the British government wants to be as involved in SAFE as it can be and wants the EU not to be restrictive. But more broadly, you get the idea that we're not going to be able to leverage defence ties to get progress in the other areas of the negotiations, are we? And actually, I wonder how far we can go in defence beyond SAFE, because the sort of institutional collaboration stuff still seems to be taking place outside of an EU framework in terms of, planning for Ukraine or whatever.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's quite a complex picture anyway, because the EU is kind of an up-and-coming player in this area, but member states are more important, and relationships with member states matter hugely when it comes to kind of defence industrial cooperation. And obviously the UK has just strengthened its relationship with Germany and France in this regard. There's a treaty or an agreement with Poland in the making. There's also kind of increased activity in terms of what we see from the E3, Weimar plus the E5, all these mini-lateral formats that are popping up everywhere. You have kind of the Coalition of the Willing activities, the Ukraine Defence Group, which is now co-chaired by the UK and Germany. So it's quite a complex picture, and it's like complementary, and the relationship with the EU is one part of it, and it's an important part, but it's not the only part. And as you say, at the moment, the conversation is only around SAFE. There are other EU defence industrial initiatives which are currently not on the table, and I don't know if they ever will be. And the European Union is obviously there's a lot of movement in this area at the moment, and it depends a bit also how the next EU budget will look like, how much more money they will kind of put behind those initiatives. So it's a bit of a kind of moving feast, I think, and I'm not sure where it will end up. It really depends on this kind of tension within the EU about whether you want to kind of prioritize actually European defense and security, or kind of more the economic side of things in your industries, and how they will resolve all these tensions. I don't know.
And of course, there's always the question about whether the EU becomes preoccupied with, stuff that's going on internally. I mean, there's apparently going to be a couple of no confidence motions moved in von der Leyen this evening, one from left, one from the right. So there's a lot of internal stuff that is there to distract them. Just quickly, I want to come back to something we touched on earlier. We didn't really talk about, which is this question of parliamentary scrutiny. And there's several aspects here. I mean, firstly, we need some primary legislation for the SPS stuff, don't we? And I imagine that's something that Nick Thomason is going to try and do next year. But secondly, we have this sort of simmering row spearheaded by that unlikely duo of Stella Creasy and Richard Tice, arguing that there needs to be greater parliamentary scrutiny over UK-EU relations. So two questions, I suppose. Is there a problem of parliamentary scrutiny? Is there a lack of parliamentary scrutiny over this relationship? And how should we address that if there is? And secondly, are there any potential pitfalls facing the government when it comes to this primary legislation over SPS, do you think?
Do you want me to bounce in here? So I think that Stella and Richard Tice are right that there needs to be a parliamentary committee in the Commons. I mean, obviously the European Affairs Committee does good work in the Lords, but looking at the way in which the government's managing the relationship in toto. I mean, they were doing some of that at the Foreign Affairs Committee earlier in the week. They obviously have huge numbers of other preoccupations. That means that individual subject areas will be going to those select committees if they're interested. That depends on different chairs, things like that, rather than having a sort of overview of how things come together. So some of the sort of interesting questions we've been discussing about the relationship between the different parts of the agreement, only really Foreign Affairs does that, and that's not really why you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, to understand how the SPS agreement interacts with that, what it would mean for Northern Ireland, things like that. You do think MPs should have a bit of a sight of that. Clearly, one of the things that Stephen Doughty was pressed on was the very unsatisfactory arrangements for parliamentary scrutiny of treaties under the CRAG, which other people have written on, but where basically Parliament only gets a go if the government can be bothered to agree to give them a go. Otherwise, they can whatever. Catherine would know more about that than me. And I think it's a really interesting question coming up on two respects. One is the sort of legislation that the government will need to bring in to give effect to these schemes. And as Catherine was mentioning, we will need to create a new mechanism to allow us to go on aligning through secondary legislation. We've already had the government put onto the statute books, and Joel, I'm sure, will want to come onto this with the product regulation and metrology bill coming through, which allows the government to do alignment through secondary legislation in slightly obscure areas that we don't quite understand what the scope is, though Joel may be able to explain quite where we think it applies and doesn't. So it'd be interesting to know what the mechanism is the government proposed, how they actually propose to involve Parliament in that. But the other thing that Parliament will need to be involved with, and I think we've still seen some complaints about the government not being that forthcoming in respect of some of the complaints in Paul Murphy's report on the operation of the Windsor framework that came about as a result of the consent vote not getting cross-community consent and therefore having to be reviewed, that was published last week, about the UK government not supplying Northern Ireland with enough advance notice of what was coming up. And one of the things that we haven't discussed at all, and I'm not sure the government has a view on what it looks like, is this much vaunted, we won't be at the table, we will have a role on decision shaping. If that's the critical moment, does Parliament get any say on what decision shaping might look like? Do they get to ask a minister, you're going off and the EU seems to be envisaging doing this thing. Here are some things we might be concerned about. I mean, how on earth does that play in? Very upstream, not necessarily sort of significant documentation there, no legislative instrument to look at. What on earth might that be? And where's the government thinking on whether there's any sort of parliamentary say on that? Because that, after all, if we're dynamically aligning, is the critical influencing moment. But anyway, I'm sure others have loads of views, but I think it's like super interesting. And it's very, very interesting that it's an area where we've seen, the chair of the Labour movement for Europe in the shape of Stella Creasy, and, the whatever position Richard Tice has in Reform, Deputy Leader of Reform, don't know whether he's that or it's one of the other ones. Richard Tice sort of, making these points, and the government fearsomely resisting, you think, in sort of, relatively disreputable reasons, I think, wanting to give Reform any possible platform. But they share that with the Conservatives, who also refused to move a motion to allow the sort of continuation of what was the Future Relations Committee into being a European Relations Committee, and they just let that lapse when that committee went, when we left the EU.
Anyone else want to come in on this question of scrutiny, or any comments on the legislation we need for SPS? Okay, go on.
I would just say, I think there's quite a lot of legislation, possibly 200 pieces need to be got through. And of course, with dynamic alignment, the clues in the title, i.e. it's dynamic, so more legislation will be proposed. And so the question then is, building on what Jill was saying about decision shaping, to what extent are we notified in advance about what's coming down the line, and how do we physically have some role in decision shaping? And also, of course, Northern Ireland, it's got a slightly different interest, and I think there's going to be quite a difficulty about how the Windsor framework fits in with the SPS. I mean, it will ease frictions on the border, that's clear, but are there going to be overlaps, and there's a lot of technical problems between the two.
Okay. Interesting. We've got a few minutes left, and just very, very briefly, I suppose there's a couple of things I'd just like to address. I mean, the first is where you all think we go from here. So from here to, say, 2029, which is a logical endpoint, I suppose, assuming we successfully negotiate the thing, and it's a big assumption, the things that we said we were going to negotiate, do we think there's an appetite on the part of the British government to go further? Do we see this as an end point or a starting point, I suppose, to put it very, very simplistically? And secondly, and related to that, and going back to partly to what Joel said about sort of Nigel Farage not kicking up that much of a fuss about the reset, is there a political problem here? I mean, does the government actually have more freedom than it thinks it does, because people aren't really that bothered about this sort of stuff anymore, and have got focus on other issues? So either or both of those. Joel.
Okay. I mean, I think the second question sort of answers the first. So I think privately, probably a lot of Labour MPs, ministers would like to go further. They'd like to do more agreements to rebuild the economic relationship, and also thinking slightly longer term. The more you bed in the norm of dynamic alignment, integration to the EU market, the harder it is for future governments to unpick. Or if you win a second term, you've built the foundations where you can maybe do something a bit more dramatic. I don't know. But the question there is, how much political freedom do they think they have to do that? And I think you're probably right. They have a little bit more than they suspect. And we've almost seen that play out in real time over the last year, from the really, really paltry manifesto commitments to an actually relatively ambitious set of proposals from where that was at the main summit. So there could be scope to do more, and this kind of, politically speaking, would be the window to do it. But I think, whether that actually happens is, I've struggled to predict how Labour will react, because they're so governed by the polls that, it could go either way.
Are you waving, Jill?
Yeah, I was going to wave. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that Peter Kyle is now Business Secretary. Peter Kyle, a long way away from being a Red Wall MP. I mean, it's MP for Brighton or Hove or somewhere like that, was also a name we got to know very well during the Brexit parliamentary process, because he was the person always with Phil Wilson putting down those amendments about second referendums and things like that. It was always Kyle Wilson, as far as I can remember, but that might be wrong, but I think it's the same person. So I think he'll be very open to that. I just think the real problem is the one you were encountering earlier, where you were mentioning earlier, Anand, which is, there's an EU advantage in SPS. The EU is quite keen on youth experience. But even where there's very clearly quite a compelling reason to give UK defence industry access to SAFE, simply because it increases European capacity enormously, French mercantilism, and France isn't getting any better governed by the moment. French mercantilism is still getting in the way. And I just don't see a giant push in the EU for saying, oh, we're doing all these deals now, let's look at chemicals and let's look at this and let's look at that. And they don't seem to be making what I think would be really interesting common cause on overhauling the joint, if you like, UK-EU regulatory framework in the light of the Draghi report and things like that. You might think, Europe, which includes the UK, has a collective regulation problem that we all need to deal with if we're going into growth. And are we really going to see serious regulatory cooperation on that and move forward in a sort of joint way rather than have each side yell level playing field at each other? So I think it's, I just don't think that's going to be a sort of major preoccupation from the EU side. And I think the UK, if it sort of raises things, is not going to necessarily find a very receptive landing place. But that may be wrong. But I think Europe's actually going to say more about that than in many ways the UK might. There may be more appetite on the UK side. I don't detect huge move in the EU, though I think Germany will be quite interesting as to where that goes, because obviously Germans were concerned about their foreign exports to us.
Though I mean, also, I wonder whether, and oh my God, we've run out of time, so that's going to be the last word. If you were an EU negotiator, you'd look at the United Kingdom and you'd look at the polling, and you'd probably seriously wonder about how much effort you want to put into negotiating something, even if you wanted to and saw an interest in it, given the fact that it might all be unpicked relatively soon. I mean, at a certain point that must start weighing on their thinking, mustn't it? Just nod because we finished.
Of course.
Sorry, I managed that incredibly badly. But listen, thank you so much to the four of you. It's good to be back. Thank you for everyone who logged in. We answered some of your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. If I were organized, efficient, and professional, I would warn you about upcoming events, but my mind has gone completely blank. So go to our website, and on the events section of our website, you can hear about upcoming events. I'm still waiting to hear from someone who's willing to give us IT equipment, so get in touch about that as well.
What about our top conference in Brussels next week?
We have a conference in Brussels next week, indeed, on Wednesday. Is that right? Well done, me. So those of you who happen to be in Brussels and want to come along, go to the website. You can sign up for that. And we have got another lunch hour in a couple of weeks' time, but I have no earthly clue what it's about because I've forgotten. So sorry about that. Go to the website and we'll see you all soon. We'll leave it at that before I embarrass myself further.